Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'd like to talk about this camera right here. It's the original Canon 1D 4 megapixel camera that came out well over a decade ago at this point. This was a camera at the time that was built like a tank. It's Canon's top of the line sports camera, but nowadays technologically is not really there. In fact, any entry-level cameras will be able to beat it. It came out like at 4,500 euros at the time, depending on where you buy it, and nowadays you can pick it up for like 150 euros. So I picked this up 150 euros well over a year ago, and I even made a video about it and also showed some sample images of this camera, well, from this camera back then from that video. Yeah, but anyway, this is not a review video of this camera, but rather about my experience shooting with this camera on a professional event photo shoot. Well, it was more of like a doctorate dinner ceremony event kind of thing, and even though that day I already had so many camera gear along with me that my back was hurting, I still brought this camera, believe it or not. And for most of the shoot I was using the 50mm 1.8, the standard lens, and also the 85 1.2, though keeping it at around f1.4, f1.6, because even though this is a very fast autofocusing camera, I didn't really trust this camera with f1.2 because it's such a shallow depth of field. But yeah, I still used it on this camera nonetheless. And yeah, of course, just in case, my main camera was my 5D Mark II because my other 5D Mark III was, and still is, in service. But yeah, anyway. And I'll be talking about the functionality of this camera and the image quality of this camera. Obviously, this being such an old camera, I wasn't really taking it that seriously for the photo shoot, or photography event rather, but I also spent quite some time shooting this camera as if like it was the only camera I had at the time. So when it comes to framing, when it came to actually photographing people in the event, I actually took it as if it was my main camera, so all of the images would also have been captured with my 5D Mark II at the time. My lenses at the time that I chose to have with me on my Canon system was the 24-70, 16-35, 51.8, the only non-L lens that I have with me, and also the 85 1.2. So 4 L lenses and 1 non-L lens, because I don't have the 51.2 for that simple reason. And of course I had my other backup system, which was the Fuji system, and I'm glad that I didn't really have to use my Fuji system. That system was there simply because it was light, and if there was anything wrong with all of my Canon system, I was able to use my Fuji system. That's why I had another system there. I already talked about why I have a Fuji system, so I'm not going to talk about that much in this video, but I'm still keeping my Canon system, don't worry. Anyway, for this video I would like to talk about both, as I mentioned earlier, both photography side and the functionality side. So more about the functionality first. So with the functionality of this camera at the time when it came out, it was obviously built like a tank, and it had all the buttons that you needed for this kind of camera at the time, and it really proved on this camera that, you know, I didn't really have to go into the menu to find all the features or the settings I want, but that's also mainly because it doesn't have a lot of fancy features that needed to go into the menu in the first place. If I wanted to change from RAW or JPEG, I can just do it right from the quality button here. The white balance button is right there. I shot the entire event in RAW anyway, because shooting in RAW actually didn't consume a lot of space in the memory card, and I only had 2 GB memory card because cameras at the time, even professional ones, couldn't take, most of them couldn't take over 2 GB. Most of them were able to take like 512 megabytes. You're still like under 1 GB type of card category. And yes, I bought that card secondhand because I couldn't find such a slow speed card with a low amount of capacity brand new. So even the card I had to buy secondhand. But yeah, anyway, this camera is actually very, very heavy. Actually, I quite liked it at some point because I was able to get more stabilized shots due to the weight of the camera balancing together with the weight of my lenses, for example, with the 85 1.2. That is a heavy lens. It's heavier than, well, actually it feels heavier. I'm not sure if it's really heavy, but it feels heavier than my 5D cameras. But yeah, that's just the feeling. Anyway, so shooting in such a low light, because it was a dinner event, the weight of the camera actually ironically helped to stabilize the image at the end because well, this camera couldn't really go in such a high ISO, and I'll talk about that later when I'm talking about the quality of the images. I'm tempted to say video for some reason. This camera does not have any sort of video at all, like feature at all. But yeah, anyway. But the buffer rate for the event, it was actually pretty okay. All the buttons are there as needed. What frustrates me when operating with this camera is that there are, I think, either 41 or 45 autofocusing points. I can't remember in the viewfinder. But I can only, like, I'm not really allowed to pick all of the single focus points because there were times when I just want to pick like a certain single autofocusing points, but I can't. Only the border focusing points are able to be single or manually selected. Otherwise, the rest will be selected with a camera. So because it's really no point to use single select autofocusing points because the point that I wanted to use was not available. I relied on the autofocusing system the whole time. Like the all points were activated at all times, and that led to some problems that I ran into. So yes, it does focus really fast, and yes, it will put quite a few of the even more modern mirrorless cameras to shame because of this autofocusing system. But because it's such an old autofocusing system, it doesn't always know the object I would like to focus on. Sometimes I have two people in the foreground and that I would like to have them to use as the frame and leading line to the person in the center, but maybe 1 or 2 meters away from them. So I would have more of like a foreground element that's blurred leading into the background element that's in focus. But sometimes it would really choose to focus on the foreground. And it also happens sometimes where I just want to focus on the foreground, but I focus on the background. Not because it didn't focus accurately, but it just didn't know what I wanted to focus on, being such an old autofocusing system. Whereas, you know, the more modern DSLRs, like even the original 7D, will be able to predict better than this camera where I want things to be focused on. Yeah, and that was pretty much about the operating this camera. I did not have a lot of like nits and picks on this camera because it's such an old camera, and I just took for granted that it will not perform as well as even my 5D Mark II. The screen, because I was working indoor, I was able to judge my framing pretty good. Don't judge your exposure completely on it. I just took whatever is being shown on the back of the screen as like, yeah, 70 to 80% of what I'll see on my computer monitor at the end anyway. And because I know I was going to tweak the files on here, I know that I didn't really need it to be 100% like exactly what I really want, because I can't get it from just seeing from the back of the screen anyway. So yeah, but that's just actually very minor. Oh, also, what I really miss, well, back then they didn't have this feature, was usually Canon has a set button in the middle, and I really miss the set button in the middle. I always had it, but you always had to press the select button, and then you can go through your menu using this camera, which was kind of weird because it's like a two-handed kind of camera. That's another negative point for me, at least, is that whatever settings you want to change, you always need to press combinations of buttons or use another hand. And with my 5D cameras, or even the more modern cameras, the thing is, when you press a button, the menu just locks in that button, and then you can just change anywhere you want. That makes the single-handed camera, like, it makes the camera a single-handed camera. Yeah, you get the idea. Whereas this, it's like a two-handed camera that I always have to press a button back here to be able to scroll around, and it's not really flexible and practical. Because imagine if I need to use a strobe on handheld or something, and I need to change certain settings, I need to hold the button and then just, yeah, it's fiddly, and I do that very, very often. But yeah, moving on to image quality, because this video is getting a bit long, or longer than I originally intended. The image quality, it's nothing new. It's 4 megapixels, and your iPhone will be able to take images with higher dynamic range. That being said, your iPhone cannot change SLR lenses, like quality of an SLR lens, and also doesn't have as big of a sensor size, so it doesn't have that much of shallow depth of field as these DSLRs will be able to deliver. But yeah, if you're using ISO over ISO 800, you'll be able to see noise when you recover shadows. But surprisingly, recovering highlights on this camera is pretty good. I should mention that this camera, even though Canon like swear by CMOS sensors, this camera was the camera with CCD sensor. Canon went that route with this camera at the time. And it really shows that the color tone and the color science back then from Canon was really different, but still really good, that I actually pretty highly respect if I were to live in that time era. But yeah, it's nothing compared to modern days, but it was really nice. And as long as I had everything framed correctly that I want, no cropping later on, I felt like I was able to actually deliver those images to my client, and actually most of the images managed to be delivered to my client, though the quality difference between my 5D Mark II and this camera was pretty obvious. But in terms of the image overall, was it deliverable? Yes, it was deliverable. But yeah, and yeah, that's it. That was, I just didn't want to make this video any longer. That has been my experience using this camera. It's not the greatest camera in the world. I don't recommend you to actually go out and shoot with this camera for professional work, because it's very limited. That being said, can you get nice images? Yes, you can. Will you be satisfied compared to other cameras? If you capture the moment, yeah, you will. But it doesn't really fare well with the more modern technology, especially with the challenging light that I was facing during that shoot, because it was during golden hour and the sunlight was pretty strong from the big glass window, whereas inside the restaurant it was this really old style dark wooden architecture, so it really absorbed a lot of light. So I had a lot of highlight coming from one side and really dark shadows from the dark wood interior on the inside, and it was just a pain to work with, especially with this camera. And it was that bad that I'm sure modern cameras wouldn't be able to actually handle it properly either. But yeah. But yeah, that's it. That was the experience with this camera. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. If there's anything you would like to ask about my experience shooting with this camera, then just ask me down below, or just send me a direct message and I'll try my best to answer it. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Have fun shooting. Bye.